Hello and welcome back to Medical Compliance with Clarissa. I'm Clarissa Benfield, our Global Director and Business Line Leader for our medical, laboratory, and life safety and security businesses here at Intertech. And today I am so thrilled to be joined by Jessica Smith from our Boxborough office. Hi, Jessica. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing great. Thank you for asking.
I'm so happy to have you today. And as I always like to do, it would be great to have you introduce yourself to the audience, maybe share a little bit about how long you've been at Intertech and some of your background and expertise in the medical space.
I would be honored. Thank you. Well, I've been with Intertech for over 18 years, working mostly in the medical devices compliance testing. I do have quite a few particular standards in my expertise. I'm the regional lead engineer for infusion pumps, high-frequency surgery, endoscopes, and I'm also a corporate laser safety officer and one of our medical laser experts, which is maybe a little bit relevant to our conversation here today.
Yes, absolutely. Very excited to dive in and talk about lasers today. Of course, we're seeing more and more medical products and devices, as well as laboratory equipment, incorporating the use of lasers. It's becoming a lot more common. And I think there are still a lot of questions from manufacturers, from industry, right? Trying to understand how the lasers are incorporated, how we test those, what they need to comply with. So I'm really excited to dive into this topic, especially as you're one of our laser experts and obviously have a lot of experience working with many different types and classifications of lasers, as well as many different products that incorporate these into them. So the first thing I want to talk a little bit about, right, is this medical device classification and how medical lasers are classified, right? So we know that there's FDA regulations and certain things that determine classification. So just baseline that for everybody, what that means when we're talking about a medical device classification for lasers.
Great. Yeah. I think for the context of this call, I'm going to focus on the FDA laser classifications. And they've broken it down into kind of four different major numerals. And a couple of those have some sub-numerals to them. So I think it would be easiest if I just mentioned each of those and briefly described what they are. Those that are familiar with international standards will see that these classes are very similar to those that are defined in the IEC 60825-1. That's the International Electrotechnical Commission version of the laser classification standard. But my understanding, the FDA has a class 1 laser. They are considered basically safe and non-hazardous in most situations. We're talking like laser printers, CD players, that kind of a thing. Then we get to a class 2 laser. These need to be visible, and they're going to be in the low power category. And the average human physiology will protect ourselves, like your blink response is typically good enough to protect yourself from these low power class 2 lasers. There is a class 2A definition. It's very similar to class 2, but it requires a little bit of a shift in labeling based upon the irradiance provided by the beam. That'll bring us now to the class 3 category. These are starting to get a little bit hazardous, potentially under normal use conditions. The 3A is those kind of intermediate powered lasers. They'll be hazardous when viewed directly. And then we have the 3B lasers. And these are going to be for when viewing the beam could be potentially hazardous, and have some diffuse reflections could also be potentially hazardous. This is the point where the medical standard 60601-2-22 takes over. It's applicable to 3B and greater lasers used in medical devices. And then the last class of lasers is class 4. These are everything above a certain power level, and they're basically considered hazardous in normal use. And the class 4 lasers can be anywhere from something that's actually cutting tissue during surgery or used for other high power applications, even non-medical like welding lasers and things like that.
Yeah, so when we think about that, right, of course, as you mentioned, getting into these class 3 and class 4, and then you have the 222, right? When we're thinking about this from a medical application, right, suddenly risk management becomes very important as we start getting into some of these more high risk lasers, right? So when you're thinking of designing your product, incorporating your risk management early into the development of your overall laser, how do manufacturers think about that, right? How do you incorporate that from an early on perspective as you're working with your risk management, knowing that some of these lasers obviously are going to be inherently quite risky?
Oh, that's a great question. Um, I think we all understand that risk management is this method used to identify, categorize, and mitigate risks and hazards that could cause harm. Well, lasers, they pose their own unique list of hazards to people, places, and things. The managing of these risks, of these hazards, will help manufacturers introduce safeguards for their products to help protect the public during use. We can remember common safeguards for lasers or mitigations are like eyewear, and
Yeah.
interlocks and audible and visible warnings to let people know that laser emission is occurring. Risk management's really critical to the product development at this stage because it affects the design of the product, the documentation, and the labeling. If you have
Yeah.
a certain power laser, you're going to want those safety precautions, the interlocks, the key control, the shroud on the foot pedal. And if you know you're going to introduce a laser of a certain power and that these standards require certain safety protections for those lasers, then it's critical that you incorporate those safety features during the design phase of your laser. And it's not just physical features, it's the actual labeling and the symbols that are used on the product. The international standards try to make these symbols global so that way anybody viewing these will understand the nature of the hazard quickly and all come from the same place of sharing information so that we're using similar terminology, similar claims about, say, wavelength and power, as well as the right color coding to let people know that this might be a caution or a danger marking.
Yeah, so key when you think about labelings and markings and what's going in your user manual, right? We see that as a lot coming up, where customers and clients have issues, right? Where things get missed. So it's so important to be thinking about that from early on, as well as you touched on, right? The alarms, right? Audible tones, alarms that come along with having a laser when a laser is in use. So lots of things that people can be doing on the early end, incorporating into their design process, things you should be considering and thinking about when you're getting started versus trying to add it all on at the back end, right? It's much easier if you consider those things from an early development process in your risk management file, which brings up another thing that we see all the time that people have questions about, right? Which is essential performance. So again, another kind of high in the sky ideal of like, okay, what is essential performance? What exactly does it mean? How does medical, lasers, how does essential performance work with lasers? What do we have? Do we have to have essential performance? How is it validated? Right. So I think that's always an interesting one. And in your experience, right, working with a lot of these different types of products and lasers, how do you see us validating essential performance for medical lasers? What are people using as their essential performance when you're thinking about, incorporating these more high powered lasers into products?
Essential performance. These keywords from the standard can be so polarizing for some people who have very strong opinions on what they should be. So I think the best place to start would be the definition from the series of standards that we're talking about. And this is the IEC or the CSA version or the ANSI-AMI version of 60601-1. They call essential performance to be the performance of a clinical function other than that's related to basic safety, where the loss or the degradation of those set limits specified by the manufacturer could result in an unacceptable risk. And it's important to point out that the definition says other than basic safety.
Mm-hmm.
Just to clarify that, basic safety is all of the generic rules that everybody has to follow. Don't crush people, don't burn people, don't shock people, don't injure somebody in a way that's already covered by a basic requirement by the standard. That's basic safety. Essential performance should be what makes you unique in a way that you still maintain safety. For lasers, this is typically the output accuracy of the laser energy. Is the power or energy level within a percentage tolerance?
Hmm.
Is the wavelength within a percentage tolerance? Is the pulse accuracy, like the rate and the duration, is that within a percentage tolerance? So the medical laser standard's looking for 20% minimum. You have to be at least accurate within 20% of what you claim. Some manufacturers set themselves a higher bar and have a lower percentage tolerance as their essential performance. But it's important to note that it doesn't have to be limited to just the laser energy. Some products are doing more than one thing, and they may be sensing a patient temperature or providing some sort of irrigation or suction. Those elements may be driven by other particular standards and or a manufacturer's claim of performance. But the topic that we're here talking about today is lasers. So generally, it's the output accuracy of the laser energy. The things that are strictly required by the standard for certain classes, like needing a key control or needing a an audible output warning
Hmm.
indicator or a shroud for a foot pedal, some of these things I mentioned earlier, those kind of fall in the basic safety category because any product of a certain category might need to have these things, where the essential performance is a kind of a definition by the laser standard saying if you don't already define it yourself, it needs to be 20%.
Yeah, exactly. That makes so much sense, right? So easy guideline for someone to follow, right? A good place to start. The other thing you kind of touched on, right, which I want to talk a little bit about, right, when we're looking at the international version of the standard, going to different markets, design considerations, right? Are there things that manufacturers can do from an early design consideration standpoint? We know we have the 60825, the IEC version of the standard, the IEC 222, right? So as someone is kind of developing their overall strategy, thinking about their laser, looking at, common markets like the European Union plus the US, plus other common markets, are there things that they should be thinking of or keeping in mind, I guess, from a design consideration standpoint?
There are. Um, we can lump all of these standards, I think, into one big pile. You'll find an IEC version of a standard. You'll find a CSA version of a standard. You'll find the ANSI-AMI version of the standard. Between you, me, and everybody else, they're all the same. Like the wording's all of the same. They just put their own name at the top of the page. With a little exception, actually. There will be country deviations. Those countries that participate in the international CB scheme and say, hey, go use the IEC version of the standard. However, for our country, we have a couple of deviations similar with what you'll find in the CSA version of the standards or the ANSI-AMI versions. They're going to be looking for mostly language differences. The great thing about having harmonized standards where everybody agrees to follow the same rules is that the testing's the same. You're going to be doing
Hmm.
the same measurements. We're going to be checking the same key controls, the same interlocks, the same foot pedals, blah, blah, blah. But when we get to the documentation and the labeling, some of the countries will have their own requirements. Very common is Canada is looking for their warnings and caution labels to be translated into French. It's my understanding Korea wants to see certain Korea symbols, so on and so forth. So really, power supplies is kind of a secondary thing to consider after language. If you're going to be shipping globally, you need to worry about international voltages
Hmm.
that you would be plugging
Yeah.
into. The United States has typically, the 110 volts, 60 hertz, but that's not common worldwide. You're going to find 100 volts in Japan. You're going to find 230 volts in Europe, and anywhere between 220 and 240 as we look globally. So if a manufacturer wants to consider global markets, obviously labeling and documentation is one
Yeah.
thing for translations, but also making sure that your equipment can be plugged into whatever voltage sources that you want to go for in a global market will certainly affect design choices.
Yeah, and again, I think that's why it's so important, of course, to identify upfront the markets that you're targeting, right? Where you're trying to ship the product. And even something when we talk about this, we have harmonized standards. That's great. But then, you get into, as you mentioned, the deviations, the different voltages, the labeling requirements. Like it's not as simple as maybe it sounds when it's, oh, we have this wonderful set of harmonized standards, but there's still this, and this that you have to consider. So I think, this idea of really pre-planning on the front end, knowing where you want to go, knowing that it's not as easy as saying, oh, great, we have an order for XYZ. We have an order for Korea. Now we want to ship there. Well, there's going to be a lot of things that you have to do to get yourself there, despite having a harmonized standard, which of course gives us a leg up, but there's still additional things that you need to be thinking about and considering when you're looking to go to some of those other markets. Yeah. So the other thing, that I've been thinking a lot about as we see medical devices advancing, we see a lot of advancements in technology, we see a lot of new and exciting things coming out. Are we seeing new emerging technologies or things that might influence medical lasers, medical laser regulations? Are there advancements in medical lasers? Are we seeing the same things that we've always seen? The med industry is moving so rapidly that it's like it almost seems like every single day we're seeing new types of technologies and new types of applications. So what about as it applies to medical lasers?
Clarissa, that's my favorite part of working in the lab is we get to see stuff before anybody else does. It's so
Yes.
exciting. New technology comes in here and we have to scramble to try to figure out how to apply standard requirements to it. For lasers, they've been around a while. And the industry has done a decent job of wrapping their mind around the hazards generally associated with lasers. There's, I guess, two real hazards we need to worry about. The kind of photochemical limits of the eye and the physical limits of the rest of the body and tissue, like the skin and whatnot. The interesting thing is the way standards get employed in devices is constantly changing.
Yeah.
Like our standards are written to account for the current technology that we know. And they usually try to cover as best they can what we can imagine that new technology might be. But we don't always, we being the standards committees and the people that work with standards, don't always know what new technology might be out there. Like if we look at the definition of the standard for a laser, right now, from the IEC versions is it's any device that can be made to produce or amplify electromagnetic radiation in the wavelength range from 180 nanometers to 1 millimeter, primarily by the process of controlled stimulation of emission. I mean, it's kind of in part of the definition of a laser. But what if somebody uses a wavelength kind of outside that range? Or what if they use a laser for a purpose that no one has accounted for in the standard? Great example is going to be the latest versions of 60825 and 60601-2-22. They've got a new classification, 1M. This is for lasers that have a specific interlock that in normal use, if we're trying to just activate the laser without this contact, that it won't emit, but it needs actual skin contact in order for it to emit. And this is the 1M category where it's normally eye safe and skin safe because you can't actually get any laser energy unless it's actually physically in contact with something. So it doesn't go to a place that could be affected by the eyes. It only is affected by the skin. Right now, there isn't an FDA specific classification for this, but the fact that the FDA says you can go use 825 and 2-22 means you kind of vicariously can use it. But it's a great example of a new technological development that wasn't currently handled by the standards, and a standard update had to be done to adapt to the new technology.
Yeah, and I think you really hit the nail on the head with that, right? We see technology move so much more rapidly, of course, than standard development. I mean, you know this, you participate in a lot of the standard committees. There's just no way that the committees can keep up with, or as you say, even future imagine, right? try to think about what technology might look like in 5 years when a standard gets published, 3 years when a standard gets published, right? Because we see technology moving so quickly. So it's how does the industry as a whole, right, do the best that we can with the standards that are developed, with these amazing technologies that are developed, with the regulations, right, to make sure that these products are going out that are safe and effective and can be used on patients. Yeah.
Yeah, great point.
Yeah, the other, trend thinking about that and really starting to think about the patients themselves that we're seeing, of course, over the last few years is this move towards much more patient-centric designs, right? So kind of the old school idea of some medical devices that we saw. Now, we see all these medical device manufacturers and everyone really thinking about putting the patient first, putting the patient at the center of all of their designs, right? How do you consider the patients within the design of products? So do you see this shifting what we're seeing in terms of lasers and the design and the regulation with these types of medical devices with the idea of more patient-centric designs? I mean, even the example that you gave of like a laser that only comes and works when it's in contact with the skin, right? You think about, you're thinking about a patient and how something's being used. And so are there other examples or things that you're seeing as it relates to the patients themselves?
Yeah, actually, I think the old school of thought for medical safety and creating a product to solve a problem was the solution of the problem was paramount. Do whatever you can to fix the problem. Patient comfort be damned. Now it seems that the trend is okay, we want to solve the problem, but we also want to do it in such a way that doesn't cause undue stress to the patients. Because there's a greater overlap between more physical medical science and psychological medical science, where comfort and good feelings goes a
Yeah, of course.
long way towards recovery and the healing process. So I think this definitely takes more of the patient comfort into account. I personally have seen newer laser products for medical use that have built-in cooling mechanisms that blast controlled puffs of air or circulate some sort of cooling medium through a contact part to help reduce the heating of the surrounding tissue during laser use. As more is known about how different output patterns affect various tissues, newer applications for lasers are constantly being developed to treat all sorts of patient issues, ranging from life-saving surgeries, routine operations to gender-affirming care and cosmetic
Yeah.
applications. All of this is now more focused on ensuring that the patient's experience um, lets them heal from the treatment as rapidly as possible.
Yeah, and I think you make such a good point too, right? Talking about some of these lasers that are used, as you say, in gender affirming care, in cosmetic procedures, right? We're seeing that a lot more, a lot of these types of devices, as we're seeing it become like very prevalent for people to want to get into the use of cosmetic lasers, and they're becoming, more and more advanced with what people can do. And again, if someone's going in for a voluntary cosmetic procedure, of course, they're going to be thinking about the patient comfort. People are paying for these out of pocket, right? You're thinking of all of those things. So when you're designing these products, of course, the consumer, patient as a consumer, right, basically is becoming the center of the, user of these products. Yeah. You did touch on it a little bit, but before we go, I want to make sure we really hit it home on the differences between the 60825 standard and the 222. I think there comes, confusion sometimes, people not understanding like which actually applies or when you apply which standard. So is there a breakdown that you can give between the 60825 standard versus the 222?
Of course. So the IEC 60825 standard it's intended to cover all laser products, whether it's medical or not. If an electronic device has a laser energy something, then it should be classified to see what information for the user or labeling and protections are needed to protect people, places, and things from that laser energy. Doesn't matter if you're doing medicine or if you're just a laser light show device or you're a cat toy. If you're a product that uses a laser, then 60825 is going to apply. Now, 2-22 is only for medical devices and only if the energy is in the 3B or higher category. We can see there's some overlap, but there's also a little bit of an interesting gap. Lasers that are used in medical devices that are lower than 3B in power don't need the 2-22 standard evaluation. The regular 60601 series and the 60825 would be sufficient. Since the FDA recognizes these consensus standards, and the FDA Notice 56 indicates that these are suitable to comply with with many of the 21 CFR requirements, then the manufacturer can utilize these IEC standard evaluations from third parties to assist in their FDA submission.
Yeah, so if I'm a manufacturer of, and I have a class 3B laser, am I applying both the 222 and the 60825, or am I only focused on the 222 because it is now gone into that class 3B level?
I'm glad you clarified. Yeah, they would both apply. So again, the 60825 is for every product that has a laser, just to figure out what power level of laser you are, what class of laser. And so if we have a 3B medical laser, then first we're going to go to 60825 to find out, yes, we are 3B. Then we're going to go into 2-22 to find out what additional medical related things that we need to incorporate into our product, perhaps labeling, perhaps documentation, perhaps safety protections in the design to account for it is a laser of a certain level used in a medical device.
Yeah, and you mentioned too, right, that you can use your third-party test data from 60825, 222 in your FDA submission to fulfill the requirements of this new updated laser notice, the Notice 56. Are there other changes that people should be aware of that the FDA has mentioned or pointed to within this new notice?
Yeah, so I think the primary thing that our manufacturers might need to consider is the fact that the standard was updated. Notice 50 had very similar wording to Notice 56. However, it was pointing to the earlier versions of 60825 and 2-22. Since Notice 50 had been issued, 60825 was updated to its latest edition of 3.0, and the 2-22 standard was updated to edition 3.1. It has since been updated to edition 4.0. But the notice doesn't currently cover that, and I don't think manufacturers would run into a big issue if they did the latest version of the 2-22 standard and kind of showed how it matches the 3.1 edition fairly well with just a couple additional requirements.
Yeah, and I think that's why, again, it's so key to, right, to look at all of the FDA's guidance documents, any of these notices that they put out, right? The FDA does a great job of being very specific at what they want to see, and they put that information out there to make sure that the industry knows, to make sure that manufacturers are aware. Of course, always be checking the recognized consensus standards that the FDA has put out there, right? Knowing which versions are applicable, as you say, right? Oh, we're already on a new version of the standard. Are you going to state of the art? Are you going to there's always going to be something that you have to be considering. So it's important to be looking at all of these things and gathering the information that you can as you're putting together your regulatory submissions to make sure that you're addressing, of course, all of the requirements and everything that the regulator is looking to see. Well, Jessica, this was amazing. Such good information on lasers. Of course, if anyone has questions, they can reach out to us. I'm happy to connect you with Jessica directly, or you can reach out to me with questions. If there's other topics you'd like us to cover on the podcast, please reach out and let us know. Thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you for the opportunity, Clarissa. This was great.
Yes, thank you so much.